My title, why you might want your brain at the very edge of chaos. It's meant to be slightly evocative, but we will get there. And there's sort of a mathematical reason to describe that and to actually suggest that you might want that. And I hopefully can offer some convincing data on that front. But I want to start by saying I've been looking forward to this talk because I've given a bunch of talks recently where I have to be very memorized and scripted and sort of stick to a specific point that satisfies a certain audience. And this seems much more enjoyable, and I'd like it to be interactive. So if I go too fast, if you'd like to ask questions, please feel free to just shout out, raise your hand, interrupt me along the way. So what I've planned to do here is try to give you a crash course in neuroscience, and then I'll basically try to pivot to this question. And so I want to start with a quote from, well, actually, no, I'm flipping the script. I am now deciding to start my talk by first crediting my laboratory. So in Illustrator, I made pictures of all the people in my lab. This actually isn't even all of them, but I have an amazing team of weird, eccentric, brilliant, wonderful trainees and staff scientists in my lab, undergrads from many different departments, graduate students from multiple programs, postdocs from a variety of backgrounds, from theoretical physics to philosophy, and they all come together and work in an incredibly collaborative fashion. Our science is not siloed at all, and so everything that I show you from my lab today is not my work. It is 100% the collective output of this group of lovable oddballs. So with that, I will start in and tell you that one of my very close friends, a sort of a famous neuroscientist, and Christoph Koch, said this recently. He said, "We don't even understand the brain of a worm." And that's true. I mean, for all of the money that we've poured into mapping out each and every connection and every molecule and every gene and every cell type in these organisms and those organisms and a mouse and a fruit fly, we can't go back and predict the basic activity and behavior of a worm. And I think I actually have an answer for that. But let me give you the lay of the land, the status quo first, and show you some fun examples that might lead you to realize, oh yeah, of course we can't understand a worm. And then I'm going to do my best to kind of turn that 90 degrees and just look at it very differently. Okay. So brains are made up, your brain specifically, is made up of 86 billion neurons. And then there are a bunch of other cell types in there that do a bunch of other important things, but we're going to ignore those right now. And neurons look something like this. So there's a cell body, and I look at this and I see an onion or a tree, right? And that's not a bad analogy to look at here. So there's some central piece of this that kind of does the life-sustaining work for the neuron, and then it wants to listen and talk. And so you can basically think of each of these branches as some stream of information. It's sort of reaching out and trying to make contact with other neurons, to listen to them, and reach out and make contact with many other neurons to influence them. And so these streams of information that are flowing between these 86 billion cells in you all the time that collectively together, they give rise to patterns of activity that constitute your internal subjective experience, every single thing that you can see, feel, think, and do throughout the entirety of your life. And so you can understand there's an immediate sort of philosophical reason to say, okay, well, we want to understand how putting a few of these guys near each other can produce, love or hate or the perception of a cup of coffee or whatever it is, right? So that's kind of I would argue, the main grand challenge in neuroscience. And then maybe adjacent to that is to say, well, given that all of these are so important for everything we do, it's pretty awful when that collapses. And 1 in 6 people have some form of brain disorder, and I think it's 75% of people over the age of 80 or 85 will die of Alzheimer's disease alone, let alone all of the other neurodegenerative diseases. So not only do we want to understand this thing for the fact that it gives rise to everything, but there's also an impetus to figure out how it fails, why it fails, and then how to stop that. And I think those questions actually converge, and I'm going to show you some of that later. But if we dig in a little bit deeper, and you get into sort of microscopy and start labeling proteins, neurons are bananas. So right off the bat, if we just do some basic math, if a neuron can either be sending a signal or not, and you have 86 billion of them, that means at any moment in time in your brain, you have 2 to the 86 billion possible configurations of on and off, 0 and 1. That's trivial compared to the number of possible states that even an individual neuron can have, because every neuron, so the blue is that life-sustaining cell body, and you can sort of see its projections, those branches and roots reaching out, and all of the green and the yellow and the red dots are connections from other neurons. So you have 86 billion neurons, and each one of them receives input from 10,000 other neurons, right? So the complexity of this system the number of states it could generate are beyond the number of molecules in the universe, right? It's bananas. And the way that we tend to think about this is, I would argue, a very knee-jerk reductionist approach. Right? That is to say, we think, okay, let's drill down as far as we can go and try to describe this thing at the smallest level possible. And so the object of interest, they're sort of the thing that we fancy the most, is usually the synapse. And the synapse is where two neurons connect to each other. So you can see this might be the branch from one neuron, and this could be the root of another neuron. And they don't actually quite touch. They spit chemicals across at each other right there. So you have these electrical signals that flow, and then at the very end they go blah, and they throw some basically little water balloons full of a chemical. Has anybody heard of the term neurotransmitter before? Right, okay, that's fairly common. So that's what these are filled with. So when that electrical signal hits the end of one neuron, it converts it into a little signal of neurotransmitter, which drifts across the other neuron. And so this is where we try to explain a lot of what a brain does. We say, okay, if those red dots, the content of those water balloons, if those red dots are dopamine, it's involved in something that feels good, right? Dopamine is what happens when you're gambling, when you do cocaine. Not that any of you would have ever done that, but you've probably seen Scarface. And maybe serotonin comes across in circuits involved in emotion. Let's see. GABA is something that's involved in the sort of actions of alcohol, for example. So we try to break the brain down into these molecular and these chemical explanations, right? And so we look for specialization and specialization and specialization, and then we maintain the same looking glass through which to analyze the brain when we zoom out a bit. So here's a what's called a coronal section. If you were to take a chainsaw and hit me like this is after I stopped bleeding, of course. This is what you would see. And we divide the brain up into functional regions. We say, okay, well, here, your eyeballs might be here. These sections are rotated 90 degrees. So I'm going to just give you some reference. So this section would be if you hit me this way with the chainsaw. Right? And so over here are your eyeballs. We say, okay, this is the occipital lobe. That's vision. And this blue thing is going to control emotion, and underneath here is going to be memory, and then up here is motor control. So we like to sort of break this up into modules, and then we assign chemical names and protein structures to those things. And so it must be this combination of anatomy and protein and chemical that explains movement or explains emotion or explains memory. Yes?
Gray matter.
What's that?
They use gray matter sometimes the brain. What's the difference?
So the brain is typically described from literally a staining perspective. You can actually see here, there's kind of two different tones. There are these lighter tracts, and those are called white matter. And then everything surrounding that that's a little bit darker is called gray matter. So that's, I'm happy to answer this. So this is what I'm saying. You guys lead me. Neurons they're sending electrical signals down their branches and their roots. And just like an electrical wire in your house, you can benefit from some insulation. Right? So neurons that send very long projections have evolved over time a fatty sausage layer that wraps around that. That's called myelin. So have you guys ever heard of demyelinating diseases, right? So MS and parts of ALS involve those long projections that actually control movement, and that insulation starts to fail. And so when you have that insulation in place, the signals can run faster. And so basically what you're looking at here are giant cable bundles, like sending information across the Atlantic. The white matter is these heavily insulated myelinated tracts, and the gray matter is the more local connections and cell bodies packed around it. But put together, those give rise to this larger macro anatomical structure that we divide up into these sort of functional modules and subunits, and we explain it and we analogize it very much like a computer, that region X computes something with some symbolic representation, and then it sends a packet of information over to region Y, which receives it, thinks about it, computes it, and sends it off to something else. Eventually, a motor command comes tumbling out, and you move through the world. And if you can sense correctly, I don't buy that explanation whatsoever. But we'll get there. Okay. But it's a lot of fun, right? You can go through history and say when people have damage in a stroke to the cerebellum, they get ataxia and they look like they're drunk all the time. Or when people have damage to their frontal lobe, a famous one. Has anybody heard of Phineas Gage? He was a railroad worker in the late 1800s, and he had a tamping rod, and he hit it into the ground, and there was a piece of dynamite there, and it sent the tamping rod, well, you can guess, right back up. And it went through his eye socket and up and out his frontal lobe. And the conclusion after this in the medical community was the frontal lobe does nothing. because Phineas Gage could still do math, he could still tamp things as long as he missed dynamite, he could go about his daily life, but he ended up getting divorced, marrying a prostitute, becoming an alcoholic, gambling away all of his money, stopped showing up for work on time. So eventually we realized, nope, that frontal lobe does something pretty important, but it's really high level. We call that executive function now, right? So it's actually through a history of damage to specific anatomical loci throughout the brain that we've begun to converge on this model to say, okay, well, in humans, the frontal lobe does this, and in humans, this lobe does that, et cetera, et cetera. Yes?
Creativity and planning, is that the frontal lobe?
I'll say planning.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, sorry. So the question is, does creativity and planning arise from the frontal lobe? So I will certainly say that planning is you might try to assess it as a clinician, right? To say, can you write out a list of all the things you need to do today and then put them in the right order so that you could get them done? That definitely requires frontal lobe, or especially not just the ability to plan, but to carry through with that. Definitely comes from the frontal lobe. Creativity is a separate bag of worms. So, okay. There's also conservation in these structures and the rough functional assignments across species. So here you can see we have, this is a lab rat. This is a brown, I can only remember the Latin name. I don't think it matters to you. Thank you, Rattus norvegicus. But it looks a lot like a sewer rat. Are you a neuroscientist? You have a pet rat?
No, I just, the Black Plague I looked at and studied for a while.
Oh, the Black Plague, yeah. So these guys will give you the plague, but their brain is actually very, very similar to our brain. And as we kind of move up through phylogeny, you can see that we begin to get larger and larger and larger brains, but the rough structure holds. And the major difference as you move up into primates and especially towards people is this folding. So the outer layer of your brain is called the isocortex, and you have about 1,000 centimeters squared on each side. So that's like taking two 14-inch pizzas and crumpling them up and wrapping your brain with that. And this sort of, this is a little bit teleological. I'm kind of like implying intelligent design here, but the idea is that you have this 2 millimeter thick sheet that expands in this epsilon direction, and it repeats itself. It's the same logical wiring loop. Whether you're talking the front of the brain, the back of the brain, it doesn't really matter. So you have this sort of idealized computational unit that has just replicated itself, and by making this really large pizza and then smashing it up, you can get a huge surface area and crumple it up into a small space. And so it's the expansion of this outer wrapping, especially the frontal aspect of it, that we see kind of growing as you move up through that phylogenetic tree, and presumably the things that really make you human and differentiable from a monkey come from that part of it right there. Okay, so this is kind of your classic view of neuroscience, and I'd like to show you a couple videos of case studies in patients that I'm going to force you guys to do a little thinking and interacting here, but I think you'll end up deriving the conclusions that I've just set you up with. So let's see, maybe I have to hit play. And let me know if you need me to adjust the volume.
However, we shall see how effective this patient is at manipulating his intonation of this utterance. The segments you will see are, first, a conversation about his upcoming move to a new house, followed next by a sample of his spontaneous automatic speech.
Now tell me, why is it that you're moving, actually?
Tunnel.
So let me pause. Somebody tell me what's happening.
Perseveration.
Gibberish.
So I wouldn't say it's perseveration.
Prosody.
What's that?
Prosody.
I don't even know what that word means.
It's your inflection of your speech. It's monotonic.
Watch more carefully.
Is it because the kids have grown and the house is getting too big, or ready for a smaller place?
Okay, what's happening?
It's normal conversation, but he just, the words are...
Right, so you can tell he has cadence, he has inflection, he has tone, he has timing, he has pauses, but the only syllable he can seem to utter is tono. And he clearly seems aware of it.
Seems reasonable. Less to keep up. Now, all your children are grown, right? How many children do you have? Three. Can you count that out for me? All right. What number is this? Right? Right. Now let's count it out.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Nice, nice. Well, since you did 4 so well, let's go for broke. Let's go up to 20 if you can.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 1, 2,
Okay.
Okay, so what happened?
He got hit in the head with a hammer, and he can't say any syllables. That's total, but he's trying to learn some numbers.
Okay, so that's something happened to him, right? He's had some damage. Either it could be a traumatic injury, this could have been a stroke, this could be a tumor. Something's wrong, but what can we immediately derive, sort of inevitably, about the brain regions that are involved in producing speech just by watching that 2-minute video?
It works.
What's that?
It works.
Go deeper.
Concepts are dissociable.
What's the major, if I ask you to say the alphabet, is that easy? It's a trivial?
Associative memory.
So what I see here is that extemporaneous speech has to be anatomically dissociable from patterned speech, right? So when you say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that's very different than thinking up what have I just said, remembering that, holding that in working memory, planning out my next speech, reacting to what you're saying. And so given that he has some focal damage somewhere, he's clearly able to still try to produce the presumably in his head, the content, but the physical control over that is somehow separable from the physical control involved in uttering patterned speech. I'll bet you he could say the ABCs. He can clearly count the 10 or 12, but then as he moves into sort of higher numbers that require maybe more vocal control or more thought, it degrades back into the tono, tono, tono. You can literally watch that transition as he hits about 12 or 13. Yeah?
Do you think he could write?
I bet you he could write just fine. Yes?
He could say the numbers, but he couldn't say anything else. Is there a reason why the numbers came out?
Yeah, it's a mathematical.
So, I mean, it could be. You have to talk to him longer, but my gut instinct and guess is that he would also be able to say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? So it's hyper-patterned things, yeah.
I was told when I was trying to learn a language to say it as fast as you could, like in counting,
Yeah.
say it as fast as you could and you'd memorize it much quicker, which was true.
Could you repeat?
So the point there is that this gentleman was told that when he's trying to learn a language, if he could say it as fast as possible, that he would learn it much more quickly, and he found that to be an effective learning strategy. For patterns. Back here, yeah.
I guess the pattern thing also applies to explanation why some aphasics can not talk, but they can sing.
Yeah,
Singing is also a pattern.
Right, so the point there is that some aphasics are able to sing but not speak. And so we see this type of thing play out all the time. And the specificity of the anatomy of the damage, of the hit with the hammer or of the tumor, has a lot to do with how it plays out. But there's a famous pianist called Clive Waring. You can look up a video of him. And he had some form of encephalopathy whereby he has about an 8-second memory, like a goldfish. And it's heartwarming and sad at the same time, because the video that you can find quickly online is him turning around and he sees his wife and he's just brought to tears. He says, I've missed you for so long. I feel like I've just woken up from the deepest sleep and I love you, I love you. And he turns around and he comes back and it does it all over again. I mean, so the love for his wife is amazing. It's palpable. But he has nothing, like by the time you finish asking him a question, he can't remember the beginning of it. But then he sits down and he plays a full symphony. Like the piano, the keyboard component of some very long piece of music. So literally the memory circuits that are involved in the extremely complex, carefully timed and patterned memory of music are somehow fundamentally different than these other long-term memory stores, right? I don't know if he can learn a new piece. There's a famous patient called HM who had severe epilepsy, and the way they used to treat that is they would cut that white matter bundle, that set of wires running from one side of the brain to the other. Idea being that if you cut that, the seizure can't kind of start bouncing back and forth and winding up. And it worked. It saved his life, but he was never able to write a new long-term memory, an explicit one. But interestingly, he was able to learn new skills, right? So you could teach him to do a thing. The classic case is a mirror tracing task where you can't see your hand except for a reflection of it, which is very bizarre because when you try to move to the right, you see your hand going to the left. It's very, very hard to do. If you try to trace a picture like that, you just scribble. But he got very good at it, although he never remembered having done it before. So these are all of our hints and patterns that I'm trying to sort of support the logic behind the conclusion that everything in the brain is kind of pre-specified and dialed in, and there's one region that has a code for doing this thing, and another region, another protein, and another cell type that have a code for doing that thing. Yes?
Someone else heard that the way thinking is this part of your brain, your linguistic is another part. Is that true?
Yeah, so in men, language centers are basically part of the temporal lobe. Oh, the question is, which part of your brain basically is involved in speech?
Or math. I'm saying math.
Math.
Or other parts of the brain. Is that true?
Yeah. So the question is math, not speech. Yes, there's going to be some regions of your brain that if you damage them, you're more likely to disrupt mathematical logic than other regions of your brain. So presumably, if you were to damage your occipital lobe, you can become cortically blind, but you'd have no problem with mathematical logic, for example. And then you get weird cases where something called Anton syndrome, somebody is cortically blind from damage, but they won't admit it. They're not consciously aware of the fact that they're blind. So it's almost like you need the cortex to report its own existence for you to even be aware of the fact that you don't have vision, right? So things can get really funky. That's sort of the broad point on it. So I wanted to show you one more example here. And so this might be one of my favorite videos to show in my Principles of the Nervous System class because of this man's reaction, not this guy, the next guy. This guy's reaction in the last 3 seconds of the video.
You know what's wrong with this guy?
He has some form of temporal lobe damage.
Yeah. So it's like area, not.
You clearly know some neuroanatomy. I don't actually know exactly where that damage is, but there's two areas called Broca's and Wernicke's that are involved in producing language. And he has some damage somewhere within those, but it's not classically one or the other, so I can't quite put my finger on it diagnostically. Okay.
I don't know. Yeah. Let me give you a hint. Okay. I'm going to give you a choice, and you tell me what this is.
Okay, I can tell you then.
Okay. Is this a clock, a lock, or a telephone?
A lock.
Is it a lock?
A clock, a lock, or a telephone?
Watch his hands.
Okay, let's rule out a telephone. A clock or a lock? Clock. Gotta be a lock. Must be a lock then.
Are you sure?
No, I'm not, but I don't recognize it as a telephone.
Mm-hmm. Do you recognize it as a lock?
No, honestly, I don't. But it's just, it really looks very indescript to me.
Uh-huh. But your hands know what they want to do with it.
I know, and they want to do something.
That's right.
I can see them.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I can just picture them, and I know that I have, it's like I'm undoing a combination lock.
Good. Huh. Okay, good. We had to work on that one, didn't we?
No shit.
So you could also get these really interesting cases where people aren't kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a splitting of consciousness, but clearly there were parts of his brain that knew exactly what he was looking at. But whatever the parts of his brain are that are involved in the conscious control of language and object identification are fundamentally separate, because the ones that are working his hands are intact, but he can't look at a picture and tell you what it is, right? But his hand is like, come on, buddy, it's a lock. There's a similar case up in Hanover, New Hampshire, at Dartmouth, where there was a patient who'd had another one of these cuttings of the tract. And this guy had such severe epilepsy, he couldn't even hold down a job at a plant where he just put eggs into a carton. And I got to meet this guy when I was an undergrad. And they would tell a story of his that, so the left side of your brain tends to control the right side of your body. And in men, the language is heavily lateralized, right? So the left temporal lobe tends to account for language. That's why in men, you're more likely to lose language following stroke. Whereas in women, if you damage the left side, the right tends to be able to pick that up. So this man was, I'm just trying to make sure I'm doing the logic correctly. So he was out trimming his hedges, and he really didn't like his neighbors. At least the left half of his brain didn't like his neighbor. No, the right half of his brain didn't like his neighbor. So he's trimming the hedges, and he is holding the trimmers with his left hand. That's right side of his brain. And he's speaking to the neighbors. That's the left side of his brain. And he's trying to be very polite. And this hand starts trying to stab them. And so then he takes, as he's talking to them, he takes then his right hand, which is controlled by the left brain, which is controlling the polite language, grabs that hand and holds it down. And his he had like clinical aides with him studying constantly at this point, and they just reported. They had to intervene eventually, but it was like a tug of war between two separate people, each of them having control over one of his limbs. I mean, it's straight out of a movie, right? So, yeah.
There was another video, same situation, where they had to try to solve, a guy put his hand, was given a spatial puzzle, 3D puzzle. The left side, the right hand was solving the puzzle easily, and the left hand was just randomly moving the parts all over the place. He couldn't.
So this is an anecdote of the same phenomenon. It's actually from the same guy. Michael Gazanaga is the one who was studying all of this and took those original videos. He was at Dartmouth at the time, and so the anecdote is of somebody who their left hand was able to solve a puzzle very well, and the right hand was trying to disrupt the left hand as it worked, right? So you can get into these really fun philosophical situations thinking about, well, that's a split consciousness. There's two people, effectively. Because if you cut the brain this way, everything is redundant. You have all of the machinery you need on each side, and they're no longer communicating, and so they start to operate independently. So,
one other fascinating thing on that is they had him put his hands through a curtain, and he felt something, and they asked him what it was. He couldn't say it. But he wrote it down, and when he saw it, then he could speak it.
Right, so that's this same, so the anecdote there is that somebody feeling something with his left hand was unable to verbally identify it, but his left hand was able to write down what it was, and then obviously sort of, but this gets back to that idea that if language is lateralized to one side, you split the connection between the two, you can end up with this type of thing. Yes?
So how do both sides, or the different sides of the brain develop completely differently? How can that be if you're one person?
What do you mean, how do they develop differently?
Well, the one guy, his left side hated the neighbor and his right side liked the neighbor.
Yeah, but
so the question is, how can this occur if you sort of have two brains developing simultaneously? But under normal context, they're connected and they're influencing each other. And you can certainly have imbalances in the allocation of resources. So for example, in men, typically language is manifest in the left, ends up being manifest in the left hemisphere. It doesn't have to be, but it just does. And so for whatever sets of reasons, and this is going to become very speculative, so I'm not going to go very far. For whatever sets of reasons, the kind of emotional salience of reacting to this neighbor on one side of his brain, he was a little more kind of tempered and controlled and sort of socially acceptable. And on the other side, he kind of said, F it, I'm going for the throat. And he got into a fight with himself. Okay.
Keith, I think his question is, how can you develop two different sides? And you can start with the aorta arching.
So this is my neighbor Dave. We're very close friends. And Dave's talking about development starting with aorta.
It's much more fundamental in the brain. The aorta branch curves one way, same way in everybody. The chambers of the heart differentiate into two sides. So sidedness is a normal part of development.
So yes, Dave's pointing out the sort of the basic sort of embryonic biology, that there is a lot of sidedness in development, and one of the interesting things in the brain to me is that you develop basically two mirrored halves, right? Okay. So with that, let me skip to the next thing. Now I'm going to get to my view of things. So I would argue that if not everything, then at least the vast majority of what a brain does cannot be explained by any of the things that I've just brought up to you. Those are artifacts of life, because the vast majority of what any brain does is learned, and it's acquired, and it is in effect unable to be accounted for by pre-programmed, hardwired, genetic, molecular, predetermined. Think about it from this perspective. Embryonically, fetally, There's no way that my brain could have anticipated that I was going to be born into the mid-1980s in New Hampshire with mountain bikes and Ninja Turtles. From a genetic perspective, I would have been the exact same brain, the same wiring rules, the same proteins, the same everything, had I been born in a cave in northern Norway in year 4, learning how to fight bears with rocks, or the same brain had I been born into year 25,000 Tokyo in a jetpack factory, and yet my brain would optimize itself. Right? We haven't had time, evolutionarily speaking, to develop a circuit for driving cars or sipping lattes or operating cell phones, and yet we do this stuff trivially every day. I mean, Dave, you don't have a neuron that was pre-allocated as the Dave neuron. You had to learn that that's your name, and yet we do that, and you do that. To be able to even say my name is Keith probably takes hundreds of millions of neurons that operate like lightning speed, and that isn't pre-programmed. And yet we find our way to some endpoint that produces that infallibly for decades. And the moment that that computational robustness fails is when we have disease, right? So part of me thinks it's a fool's errand to seek these predetermined molecular explanations of everything, because based on first principles, that can't explain almost anything we do. You can vaguely explain broad swaths of categories of information, and that's about it. And so drilling down and drilling down and drilling down and down and down is why we can't even understand the brain of a worm.
Are you then just discussing emergent phenomenon of complex systems?
Let's go. All right. So I think that the most important thing is that, actually, let me go back a slide here. So it can be very tempting to think then that because I'm talking about adaptable, situation-specific, computational emergent endpoints, that implies a total lack of constraint, right? That every neuron or circuit or whatever is free to kind of wander through the landscape as some function of nature and nurture together and find its own endpoint. But the problem here is that the ability to just, in a very, very fundamental sense, the ability to transmit or transform, to calculate information in any complex system is neither inevitable nor is it trivial, right? So I want to run one more analogy here, because I'm skipping over some mathy slides. I think the right way to look at it is that the brain shows up to a game show, and it doesn't know the rules, it doesn't know the content, it doesn't know the topic, it doesn't know the format, it doesn't know the history, it doesn't even know the language of the show. And so all that it can do, the only impetus for a brain, evolutionarily or developmentally, is that it has to pick some starting point, some computational arrangement that maximizes its likelihood of success faced with an unknowable and unpredictable challenge of arbitrary complexity. Right? And so that question is then, what the hell is that point? And then how do you ensure its persistence? Because as soon as you start learning things, you're breaking all the rules. You're twisting all those little connections. You're making these ones stronger, those ones weaker, and all of a sudden the wheels come off. So there must be some optimal starting place, right? Because say you have 1 million animals and 1 million animals. They have the same brains, but these ones start out a little closer to that optimal point, and these ones start out further from it. These ones lose evolutionarily. These ones win. So with that, we get to the concept of homeostasis. I'm going to go over that because, Chase, I bet you don't know what homeostasis means. No? Okay. This is my 11-year-old son. This is what we do on a Saturday morning. All right. So homeostasis is the tendency to maintain some property of a system stably despite fluctuating external conditions. And the classic example for this is your house. Now, Mikhail, what temperature is your house? 70. So you could say my house is 70, so therefore it's a homeostatic set point, right? Now, sure, maybe, but it's an easier explanation to just say, well, maybe that's the ambient temperature. You don't live in St. Louis, maybe you're in San Diego, and it just happens to be 70 degrees outside. So the way to actually assess that something is homeostatically maintained is to push the system. And so in this case, that would be take your house in February and open all the windows. Now, in St. Louis, the immediate effect of that is obvious. It's going to get very cold very quickly. That's not interesting. Things get interesting if you leave those windows open, because over time, if temperature is homeostatically maintained in your house, the house will fight back, right? You'll turn on the furnace. You'll sense the deviation from the set point, and you'll start to push back against those windows being open. And then, despite the fact that you've left the windows open, the house will claw its way back up to 70 degrees. And so it's in that context that you can actually say, my house is homeostatically regulated around this set point, right? And so I think that I think that this is the most important question that we can ask about how and why brains work, is to figure out at an emergent level, at a computational level, what is that point that we're showing up to the game show with? Because every day when you wake up, you're back at that game show. You don't know what you're going to encounter today, and yet you need to be optimally performing no matter what it is or how environments change. And I'm going to skip through the experimental evidence for this, but the next concept I'm about to show you, we established in 2019 as the key homeostatic set point. And that's actually kind of launched the career now of my lab and all the students in it. And so, okay, let me make sure that loaded correctly. Great. It's not trivial to move information through a complex system like a brain. So if I ask you to imagine building a brain, you've got, again, 86 billion neurons, you wire them together, you have an almost infinite number of degrees of freedom in making decisions. These cell types connect to those, we're going to have this structure here or not there, et cetera, et cetera. What you'll very, very quickly realize as you go through this experiment is that almost the entirety of what we call the solution space, the parameter space, the number of options you have, it's infinite. Almost the entirety of it is a complete and utter failure. It will not work. And what would happen is that as you traverse that huge landscape of possible options, you'd go from total failure, total failure, total failure, total failure, and then you take one step, and now you'd be failing in a very different way. Or you'd have some massive phase change. All of a sudden, you'd go from liquid to gas, right? You'd have some change. And so what I want to illustrate to you is that type of change and the sensitivity of the system right at the border, because that's where the magic happens. So here we're going to illustrate. Imagine having a single knob to turn now. So maybe as we starting from 0, as we turn this knob, we're going to slowly increase the excitability of these neurons. Okay? So as you give it a tiny little nudge, what you'd see is some sparks appear for a moment. They'll flicker and then die out. Right? Now this brain is very stable. It's not having a seizure, but it's also completely useless to you as any form of organism, because in a system that is kind of this inert, this damped, this quiet, there's never, you could try this a million times. If you put in Morse code SOS down here, it would never be able to move through this network. It would just fail. It would just die. So if you turn that knob a little further, say to a 3 or a 4, these sparks will grow a little bit, and now they'll jump between a few neurons and start to make some small patterns. But again, from a survivability perspective, this is still too damped. It's useless to you. Now then, at some point, you'll hit a very, very narrow window where streaks of activity begin to branch out and sort of race across multiple networks here, 2, 3, 4, sometimes looping back and starting new patterns all over again. And the key point to realize is that here, and only here, as you turn that knob, every single possible pattern of gray and blue becomes available to you. So if you were to just run this thing indefinitely, you'd eventually see a picture of Barack Obama, or you'd see all the letters of the alphabet go marching by, perfectly drawn, right? Every single pattern becomes available to you here. But then if you take a single step further, you just turn that knob a notch further, and it becomes the mathematical definition of an atom bomb. It grows exponentially. 2 becomes 4, becomes 8, and we're off to the races with a seizure. This is all just chaos and noise and just epileptic junk. Okay, so you'd find many of these different types of transitions between different regimes, but it's the key point to make is that it is at that last step where sort of all of the raw ingredients of computation, especially complex computation, become maximized. And so we want to be a little specific about this. You simultaneously maximize your ability to transmit information across long distances. You maximize your ability to store information, sort of memory within the system. You maximize what's called dynamic range. That is, think about your visual system. You can walk out of a dark theater into bright sunlight, and you have millions-fold change in the number of photons hitting your retina, and you can see well in both of those. And that difference between the smallest and the largest stimulus is called dynamic range. That's maximized in this system. Yes?
It seems that if you're switching or connecting, you're using energy, correct? As you make these connections, you're using some level of energy.
Yes.
And it seems like you're maximizing your energy to accomplish this. Each one of those transitions would be adding to the energy. So you're saying you're a very high energy state. Is that true?
So the question is if this is a very high energy state. So I mean, I think about this from a metabolic perspective. The vast majority of a brain's energy, of a neuron's energy use, is just maintaining membrane potential at rest. The actual spiking is so short and transient that it doesn't contribute a ton. So for example, when you sleep, it's not much of a metabolic saving. It's not that neurons fall silent then. And then here, this is the exponential regime. It's not a kind of a runaway explosive regime where neurons are just firing continuously. So it's certainly not the most energy expenditure you could have, but it's probably more than a totally inert state, but you're dead then anyway. So, okay. So this point was sort of originally described in statistical mechanics and theoretical physics as almost a thought experiment, and they called it criticality. And the original idea is basically the following, that if you think about snow or a pile of sand, the most stable state is if the system is flat, right? There's nothing interesting happening here. And then as you slowly sort of increase the slope of this system, at some point, it becomes unstable and everything avalanches and falls off. And so then if you find the slope that is neither stable nor unstable, it is the least stable of the stable states, right? It is that one step before an avalanching chaotic state, then you get very interesting behavior as you continue to kind of add some sand to the system. You'll get small avalanches and large avalanches. You'll have periods of stability, periods of unrest, and you'll begin to see things of all scales and all sizes. And I think that this makes intuitive sense in terms of understanding a brain, because if I ask you, what is the intrinsic spatial scale or time scale of the brain? This is a stupid question, because we can find explanatory power about how a brain works in the microsecond activity of channel kinetics, of how proteins move, to the millisecond of how a neuron fires an action potential, to the hundreds of milliseconds of how circuits process information, to the tens of seconds involved in fMRI, to the hundreds of seconds or hours involved in many other brain processes, right? At every scale, we have meaningful information about a brain. You don't experience your world in chunks of 4.3 seconds, for example, right? It's a continuum. You bring information from the last 2 seconds, you're here presently, but you also, each of your internal experience, despite the fact that each of you is seeing and hearing the same exact thing right now, your internal perception of this, presumably, is very beautifully unique because you're bringing information from this morning. I don't know if you got in a fight with your dog. You're bringing information from last week. You're bringing information from your childhood. All of that impinges on all of those timescales collapse into this moment throughout your entire life. And that arises from, or is characteristic of a system that is tuned to this least stable of stable points that maximizes computation, broadly speaking. And so given that you could never have been born with a neuron that knows that your name is going to be Dave, you can't predict that you need to have a meaningful connection between this cell here and that cell there. You need to start out at that place where those blue dots can explore the entire landscape and find that solution. And then what you need is to be able to cement that in place. Yes?
Wouldn't this least stable spot be dangerous? Because isn't our brain trying to protect us, like trying to keep us alive for as long as it can?
So the question is this least stable state dangerous? I think that the right way to think about it is this, that this is dangerous because nothing can happen. You can't live here, right? This is dangerous because you're having a seizure and you'll die. And so there's sort of a logical, and I would argue then biological, imperative to get as close to this line as you can and not step across that line. Right? So there are people in my lab working on the kind of intrinsic protective mechanisms that the brain has actually architecturally built in safeguards, firewalls, so that it becomes hard to cross that line. And when we block those, when we remove those safeguards, we replicate epilepsy, for example. Okay, so I want to show this in a slightly different perspective. So it's not just about these spatial patterns, it's also the timescales that I was talking about. Because when we look at a wiggle that we could record in the brain, one of the really cool and weird things that my lab has noticed is that without a scale bar, it's very hard to tell whether this is a millisecond or 20 minutes of activity. And so when we zoom out and coarse grain and zoom out and coarse grain and zoom out and coarse grain, what we see is in a system that is at this critical point, we see the same, statistically speaking, these are all the same. It actually turns out this trace is from the center of that one, this is from the center of that one, and so forth. But they never kind of fall apart. And what that means is this can hold information at the millisecond time scale as well as the hours time scale. And if we move that brain ever so slightly away from this critical point, this is what happens. Let me show you here. We still hold information at this fast time scale, But as we zoom out and zoom out and zoom out, this becomes white noise. And one of the definitions of white noise is that each point has no influence on the next point, as in it doesn't transmit any information into the future. So this is a goldfish, right? It has an 8-second memory. What happened 9 seconds ago has nothing to do with what its brain is doing right now. It is independent. Whereas this brain, every moment of its existence has some explanatory power over where it is right now, right? So yes.
I'm curious. Are you using goldfish as a metaphor?
Yes, because there's a classical thing in popular culture to say goldfish have an 8-second memory. I have not studied that. I suspect it's not actually true, but this is a Saturday science thing, and you're making it a Monday science. This is simulated, but I will say the following thing. We can very, very rigorously and mathematically assess whether or not real brains are here or tuned to this point. And let me just show you the spatial. So this is my point about criticality, is that whether we're talking about space, I mean, think about this. Individual neurons are microns apart from each other, but they're also tens of centimeters. I mean, you have orders of magnitude difference in spatial domains. Do you want to communicate with this neighbor or that neighbor? Do you want to communicate simultaneously, or do we want to have a 20-second lag or a 5-hour lag? You can only access all of those possible scales that are obvious to everything we do all day long. You can only access those if you're near one of these least stable of stable states transitions. So here's the same thing in space. If we were to look at neurons that are on and off in white versus dark here, as we zoom out and zoom out and zoom out, in a critical system, you see the same structure, the same patterns, and in a slightly this is 2% away from criticality. You can see that there's structure when we zoom in. But this brain becomes white noise. You're never going to transmit information between your frontal lobe and your visual cortex if you're tuned here. So the first place, yes?
Can I just say, what was the squiggle? What was the vertical axis? I mean, you had indicated the different time scales.
Here?
But yeah, what is that? Is that?
This would be voltage, right? So when we stick an electrode in the brain, you see a wobble with voltage. And it's structure in that's carrying information, but now that we're gonna get into like a Tuesday science pretty quickly, but happy to talk about that in a moment. Okay, so the first place where I thought this could really resonate is sleep, because why we sleep has been, I mean, I would argue it's been kind of one of the grand challenges in biology and physiology for as long as we've understood the concept of biology and physiology and sleep. But certainly for over a century, we've known that we need sleep, and yet we don't know why. So let me walk you through a little exercise. This is me in the morning, the good-looking 1950s, version of me. I'm sharp, I'm on point. By the end of the day, the wheels start to come off. I'm a little fatigued. I go home. But I have a 1-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old tornado in addition to this guy. And so at about 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm losing my beans. Now, if you do psychophysics, my reaction times are worse. I have emotional instability. I'm irritable. My verbal fluency begins to decrease. Actually, my motor control begins to fade. And if you push this much further, if you go, you can look this up on Wikipedia. There's a kid who stayed awake voluntarily for 13 days straight. You'll begin to hallucinate, right? You'll actually your ability to control respiration changes. Literally every single thing that your brain does begins to degrade, and eventually you'll die. You actually die from sepsis and non-neuronal things, but the point is, you have to sleep. And so if you were to present this circumstance in any other context, loss of language, irritability, emotional problems, hallucination, you'd be in the back of an ambulance like that. But we just take for granted that one night of sleep and boom, we're back online as the most complex, beautiful computers in the universe. We just take this completely for granted. And so we've been seeking a molecular explanation of sleep for as long as we've been able to do science, and we can't find one. So my lab tackled this from the criticality perspective, using a control theoretical approach. And the idea is as follows. If you think that your furnace is involved in temperature in your house, I would argue the best way to ascertain that is to measure everything you can about the house and ask if you can predict the future activity of the furnace. That is to say, does the noise of my children in my house predict that the furnace is going to turn on? No, it doesn't. What about the lights? Does the fact of light being on in my kitchen predict the furnace turning on? No, it doesn't. What you'd quickly realize, though, is that every time the temperature dips, odds go way up that the furnace is going to kick on in the next hour. So we developed the technology to be able to record from hundreds of neurons at a time across the entire lifetime of laboratory animals. And so we just let them do their thing for months. And then we could go back and do a bunch of math and machine learning on it, but we would basically look for periods when the furnace is on, where the animal would spend a lot of time awake, or where the furnace is off, where it spent a lot of time asleep. And then we could just roll back the clock and say, okay, what's going on in the brain that predicts that, right? Can we get insight into the set point, the thing that the brain is regulating itself around through sleep, to understand this problem? And we needed to compete against the best thing that we've got in the field. It's a heuristic model, and it has nothing to do with the brain, but it's the status quo. That is to say, I'm really good at knowing when you're going to be asleep and awake, Dave, if I know what time of day it is, and I know how long you've been awake for. Right? 3 o'clock in the morning, you've been up for 27 hours, pretty good odds you're about to fall asleep. And so our question was, is there anything in the brain that we can say goes above and beyond that? Right? So the first thing, let me just show you this. So here's shuffle of data. Rats and mice tend to be awake about 50% of the time across a day. And then here's the base model does a hell of a lot better than that. And again, the base model is non-neuronal. So then we just went through the literature and we took every single feature of a neuron's activity that people have ever predicted as being the central purpose. Maybe neural activity speeds up during the day and sleep turns it back down again, right? So we went through everything. We made a laundry list. And it turns out none of those things have any predictive value above and beyond what we already know. But then if we simply add in distance from criticality, we do a heck of a lot better. And if we put everything together with the distance from criticality, we don't get any increased benefit over that. So then we can take this model and crack it open and actually ask the model, what did it learn from? So this is sort of the essence of machine learning, right? That it learns in an experience-dependent fashion, and it says, oh, this has a lot of value, and so it puts more weight on that. What we see is that the only things it cares about is the base model, and even more than that, distance from criticality. And so the only thing in the brain, so what this means is that the further an animal is from criticality, the more likely it is to be asleep soon. Right? And that's because as you move through the day, so imagine you start out, you tune your brain very carefully to be at this point, criticality, and then you move through the day and a blue elephant walks in front of your house. Oh, now you've got to connect the elephant neurons with the my house neurons and the I'm surprised neurons. So what you're doing is you're changing the setup of this network. And so experience means that you're just going to, at best, you're taking a random walk away from this. That is experience and learning. That's what it means to move through the world. And so as you get further and further and further away from there, you're getting worse and worse and worse and worse at computing. This has direct explanatory power for my experience at 3 o'clock in the morning. That is why every single thing is degrading. You don't need to invoke, how many things can your brain do, Chase? He's like, oh God. A lot of things, right? So there's two explanations here. One is that every single circuit in every species at every point in life in every environment has evolved its own specific molecular whatever endpoint that happens to have all co-evolved to take advantage of sleep. Or alternatively, there's a unifying computational principle that can explain why any circuit is able to compute anything, and sleep fixes that. And so the kind of Occam's razor, rule of parsimony here is that this is on. Now, the field loves this thus far, which is great, because usually when you publish things, people tend to beat you down. But I think that this has really kind of hit a nerve with a lot of folks in the field, especially the molecular people, because now they have an explanation for what this molecule or that molecule might be working towards. Yes?
I'm confused. What are these acronyms? Are these molecular?
No, so these are different features. Right? This is the neuron's firing rate. The delta wave is, have you heard of slow wave sleep? Okay, so when you sleep, you can have REM sleep, so that's rapid eye movement sleep, and that's when you have like really vigorous dreams, and then you have slow wave sleep, which is known to be the kind of restorative feature of sleep. And for a long time, we can measure the amplitude of the slow wave, and that actually reflects sleep pressure. If you've been sleep deprived for a long time and then you fall asleep, you have much larger slow waves. But none of those things predict the future behavior of the system. So we kind of went through the entire brain activity landscape that people have hypothesized as being the potential setting. And the only thing that seemed to have mattered in brain activity is distance from criticality. And we've replicated this now in rats and mice and in humans, both children and in adults. So let me zip through a few more things because I know I'm going to run out of some time soon. Yes?
Isn't sleep related to the glia cells cleaning up the brain's waste products?
So that is, so the question is, isn't sleep related to glial cells cleaning up the brain's waste products? And I'm going to say to that what I say to every molecular explanation is, why? I mean, sure, there's many things that are happening. To what endpoint? Because the only thing that evolution can select for is behavior. Hard line, stop. And the closest thing in the brain to behavior is network dynamics, right? The presence or absence of junk between cells isn't intrinsically good or bad unless it influences some aspect of brain activity. The same logic holds with Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is not tau and A beta, these toxic proteins. It is only a disease because they somehow degrade the brain patterns that account for your ability to recognize your wife or your child or your dog, right? And so it's not actually that we want to remove these proteins or remove muck between the cells, it's that we want to restore optimal patterns in the brain. And so my guess is the following. There are many molecular changes that play out all of the time that are necessary to move a brain back towards criticality. That's not happening magically, right? There has to be some tangible underpinning of that. But without this, without that explanation of what's actually happening in the brain, all of those things are arbitrary. They don't have any intrinsic value. I mean, you could just as easily argue, well, maybe delta waves go down when you need a lot of sleep. It doesn't mean anything intrinsically. Right? Okay, so let me just zip through a few more pieces of evidence. So we're going to take the same exact logic with development. Somehow, across the course of development, a fistful of cells need to come together to produce you. And as I mentioned to you earlier, when you have the ability to explore all of the pixel combinations, all of the blue and gray combinations, you maximize your ability to learn anything. And this is taken as dogma in machine learning. You have to initialize your models at a critical transition. Otherwise, you won't learn, or if you do, it's going to be massively slow and expensive. And so we'd say, okay, well, maybe the same thing holds in people. So with a team of collaborators over at the medical school, we have brain scans from 261 infants, and they're scanned within the first week of life. Right? So some of them are scanned on the day that they're born, other kids are scanned before they leave the hospital. So we have a 10-minute view into their brain activity of an infant, and then our colleagues have followed these kids for the next 6 years. Let me skip over the math here. The first thing to point out is that we can now, because we can see the whole brain with fMRI, we can say every single brain region is pretty darn close to criticality even at birth. Specific predictable subsets are a little further than others, but they converge over time. That doesn't really matter because the key point is that we can, with this data set, and I don't think there's anything else like this in the world, we can ask if there's anything that we can see in the brain at day 0 and predict language function at age 2. Here's the shuffled data just to show you our machine learning isn't overfitting. But ALF and Hurst, these are two very popular measures in the fMRI field. Neither of these things, intact data, intact shuffled, has any predictive value. And why would it? This kid doesn't even know what language is yet. They're 0 days old. But when we look at proximity to criticality at the day of birth, we have what I'm told is a staggering amount of, like an almost unbelievable predictive value over the ability of that child to speak 2 years later. Okay, now, last little pieces of data, and then I guess I've got to I'm going over. These are my drawings of Jimmy and Ravi. Jimmy is a grad student in my lab. Ravi is an MD PhD, so if any of you guys have a neuromuscular problem, you've probably seen him. He's in the clinic a day a week over at Barnes. They're very interested in this problem in terms of motor learning. And so they developed this assay. I love this. So this is a mouse, and it is going to fight against a Turkestan red runner cockroach. There, let's see, hold on, there's the cockroach right there. And this mouse was from Jackson Labs up in Maine. So this mouse was raised in a pretty sterile environment, and other than its mom and a couple litter mates, it's never seen another organism in its life. And it's not a very good hunter, as you can see, right? And so this is a very hard task. This is the equivalent of, say, like a 25-year-old person finally being told, you need to go forage for yourself. And they're like, wait, what? I don't have Grubhub? And the mouse is trying, and it's struggling, so you just lost it. I think this is a successful trial. Oh, no, not quite. I think the cockroach is in. Okay, so now the mouse eats the thing. So this is a hard task. Some mice just don't learn how to do it. Some of them take a lot of exposures to figure it out. Over time, most of them get there, but this isn't trivial and it's not easy. And so Ravi and Jimmy took the perspective that if they looked at distance to criticality in the motor cortex the day before the first trial, could they do? There's literally nothing in the brain that you can measure to tell me how well I'm going to do taking a new class next week. You could look at my behavioral history and be like, yeah, you kind of flunked a lot of classes. You're probably going to suck next week too. But there's nothing you can measure intrinsically in the activity of my brain that would tell you the same thing until you meet Ravi and Jimmy. So note that all of these mice are fine. None of them have severe deformities. These are not models of neurodegeneration. So they are all, this measure we're using D2 here. Forget the values, they're all very close to criticality. But just like blood pressure or body temperature, there's a range, right? Some people are a little warmer, a little cooler than others, but those all look pretty close. You could squeeze a little line in there and just say, most of them, that kind of divides them about 50-50. And so if we do that on a Tuesday, and then we take these same mice on a Wednesday and introduce them to a cockroach, what we see is that we can almost perfectly predict who's going to learn how to hunt on that first day and who's not. Now similarly, Ravi and Jimmy, now they're applying this to ALS, and we can actually predict ALS the equivalent of decades before you can see it in a clinic. And this is Ravi's specialty. But these are wild-type, healthy mice. They've built the cage. The mouse lives in this for about 100 days. And the mouse has its water on one side of this ladder and its food on the other. And so the mouse has to be able to cross this ladder, and it learns how to do it. But it's tough at first. They kind of stumble, and they figure out their way. And then after a few hundred trials, they're zipping and running back and forth across this thing. And we took the same question to this. In the motor cortex, if you look at the distance from criticality the day before the mouse goes into that ladder, can you actually predict the ability of that animal to learn a complex motor sequence? So here's the example of learning. This animal crossed 1,400 times in the first day. They're not eating and drinking that much. They like this. It's a pretty boring life being a lab mouse, right? Most lab mice, they just eat chow and they just sort of sit there and smell themselves. And so this is the big time as far as these mice are concerned. And so our question is basically, can we actually mathematically describe the fit of this curve by looking at how close that animal was to criticality before it started? And it turns out, with the exception of this one mouse, you can fit that almost perfectly, right? Okay, last piece, and then I'll close. The flip side of this coin, axiomatically, if proximity to criticality determines a brain's ability to be cognitively flexible and integrate information and make long-range connections and merge different modalities of information, then any broadly deleterious disease that degrades cognition must be a degradation of that same mathematical formulation. And so if we turn to neurodegeneration, I'm actually going to skip this video just for the sake of time, and I'll go here. If we turn to neurodegenerative disease, nobody knows the answer to this question. And here's the problem. If I show you a pattern of spiking, we call this a raster plot. I just make a tick. Let me draw this. Where'd my chalk go? Behind me. Thank you. If I say, these are the times that neuron A fired, and then these are the times that neuron B fired. And I actually do this in kind of my more Tuesday talks. I'll ask people, which one of these is from an animal that is about to die of tauopathy, sort of a model of Alzheimer's, and which one of these is a young, healthy animal that will never die of disease? And the problem is, I would argue, this is where the disease has to exist. The only reason a disease is a problem is because you somehow impede or muck up or degrade the patterns that neurons can generate. That is it, and yet we have no clue what that is. And so to solve that problem, my postdoc, James, to get through the pandemic, made 500-day-long recordings. So he implanted mice with electrodes in the hippocampus. That's the region that's sort of most rapidly devastated by Alzheimer's. And he gave these animals a human transgene that effectively gives them Alzheimer's. And at about 9 or 10 months of age, they start to have problems, and they're dead by 14 months. And he said, okay, I'm just going to record activity continuously for the entire life of this animal. And then I do the same thing in healthy animals. And I'm going to ask, when are they differentiable? When can I train machine learning models to accurately tell me who's who here? And to the credit of the field, there was nothing that differentiated these. It's not that neurons consistently got faster or slower in animals that were really sick. They didn't get more random or more sort of predictable in animals that got sick. That is until he looked at proximity to criticality. And he found that early in life, and also in healthy animals, almost all animals are always very close to criticality. And as the sick animals get older, they get progressively further and further and further away from criticality. And the really interesting thing to us is that that disruption and deviation from criticality begins the equivalent of decades before somebody would show up in a clinic. Long before there's any molecular manifestation that we can detect in the blood, and long before there's any behavioral or cognitive problems. So the distance from criticality was actually the best predictor we had of underlying molecular changes compared to any other measure out there. But the problem here is that dogs aren't horses, the same way that mice aren't people. And so we teamed up recently with the Knight ADRC here at WashU. And we can now apply some of these mathematical measures to human data. So here's the brain of a middle-aged person, I think they're in their 60s, who's cognitively normal and who will not die of Alzheimer's disease. And I've colored every brain region here as a function of its distance from criticality, where darker and bluer is objectively better. Now note the difference, and I'm sorry if you're red-green colorblind. Here's the brain of a cognitively normal person at the same age who will die of Alzheimer's disease. And the important point to make is that if these two people walk into a clinic, they are indifferentiable from a diagnostic standpoint. But to us, they are trivially separable. And now here's the brain of a person who has mild cognitive impairment. So they have the first symptomatic stages of Alzheimer's disease. So these two people will die of Alzheimer's. So again, from a clinical perspective, these brains look the same. And from our perspective, these brains look the same, and this one on the right is just a little bit further along that spectrum. You can see that certain brain regions, actually the ones that we know end up building up these proteins, are starting to get more kind of pink and orange and sunset colored.
What's the biomarker that you're talking about?
I'd have to check,
okay.
But they have a lot.
Biomarker, though,
yes, so the ADRC, there's a whole class of people who have what are called familial Alzheimer's. So they might have a gene that massively increases the risk. So if you have a gene called ApoE4, I think you're something like 17-fold more likely to die of Alzheimer's. And then they also have PET scans and blood work on these people to know, do you have elevated levels of amyloid? And I'm not sure what the biomarker is in this person. I'm just told we were given as a test 5, 5, and 5 people just to see if this would work. And what I can show you here is that we can tell you who has Alzheimer's disease, we can tell you who's going to get Alzheimer's disease, and we can tell you who's not. And we can do all of that by looking ahead of time through the lens of criticality. And so with that, I should thank, obviously, all the people who did the work that I showed you up front, as well as an incredible list of collaborators that span many of the departments here on the Danforth campus at WashU, including physics, as well as people across the park over in the medical school, and then friends at other universities, as well as, and I will say, for anybody here who's old enough to vote, the ice is extremely thin right now, and I am relying on emergency funding from private foundations at the moment because all of our grants have been frozen. So, and we're not studying the hot button issues, I think. Okay, so with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you for letting me go over.
Well, you are studying about wokeness a little bit there.
Well, I mean, sleep and wake is pretty woke, that's true.
But I have a question about Tononi, I think, has to kind of come up with this neuroscientist.
Yeah, I actually rotated in his lab. I know him very well.
So he's got, how's it turned? I read this book by him a while ago. He was trying to develop a machine that would detect consciousness in seemingly comatose people.
Yes.
And she'd give the brain a stimulus, and when it died out or to detect criticality. Is that?
So yeah, so actually that's a wonderful question. So this gentleman brings up a friend of mine, Giulio Tononi, who has a theory of both sleep and consciousness, and it is called the integrated information theory of consciousness. And so Tononi's argument is that for a system to be conscious, it has to have something called internal cause-effect power. That is to say, it can change its own internal state, and the number of states that it can move between determines the depth or the possible range of that consciousness. And one way to assess this in people is to hit them with and I actually did this when I was in grad school, mucking around in his lab. You hit yourself with a transcranial magnetic stimulation, and you do that repeated numbers of times, and you ask, how many different patterns do you see after that? And so there's sort of 2 points to bring up there. So one is, his measure of IIT, phi, is maximized at criticality. Right, so it is an adjacent measure. And the second thing is, that can't explain consciousness because an Excel notebook can have a very high phi value, but it is certainly a prerequisite for consciousness. But I mean, it's detecting something important, and I think that, you know, if I look at our work, that if you look at sick animals and you look at sort of all of these things, that as criticality collapses, you're sort of moving away from what we consider being an enriched, cognitively viable state. Whether you're measuring it as phi or D2 or DCC, you're getting something important about how a brain is processing and moving information. Whether that's consciousness, I call that the C word, and I don't use it. Yes?
I hope you're familiar with the word terminal lucidity. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal about, at the point of death, people whose mind has not been functioning, they're suddenly lucid and they could recognize and even talk to people that they hadn't been able to do before. Have you know anything about this?
So the question is the idea of terminal lucidity, and there are anecdotes. You mentioned one published in Wall Street Journal of people sort of who are dying of neurodegenerative diseases, for example, who at the moment of death suddenly become lucid. I have certainly read those. I lost my father to early onset Alzheimer's. Chase, you were 3, so I still choke up when I talk about that. And I did not see that, unfortunately. And when he was in that home, I never saw that in any of the other people who died while I spent 2 years in that home. So I certainly don't believe that is a rule. I'm not discrediting the fact that it may happen. Certainly, though, in his journey through that, there were moments, not at death, but there were moments of brief lucidity. So if I put on Rolling Stones, for example, something would click. I mean, this is, he was drinking through a straw, and the only person that he would kind of even acknowledge was, Chase in his diaper at that point. But the Rolling Stones would cue something. So the idea of kind of momentary resurrection of the kind of interknit aspect of cognition just sort of bubbling up for a bit, I'm totally into it. But unfortunately, I don't think it's a rule at the end of life. Yes?
There was, to that comment, there is a great documentary called Alive Inside about a sociologist that brings music to Alzheimer's people. And when he plays music of their period, it seems like all of a sudden they come alive. And they remember stuff they didn't remember. I mean, it just grows in them. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so here's sort of similar studies showing that if you play music especially music from people sort of the era whenever they were teens in neurodegenerative diseases, that can cue a lot of kind of momentary changes in the right direction, and that's well documented. And it's really easy to demonstrate yourself, and that it's because of those studies that I would go in, and I actually brought, my dad had a big stack of vinyl, and I brought that over to what's called the Birches, the place where he spent his last few years, and I'd bring out Dylan and stuff, and it was amazing. It was brief, but it was just a little spark of humanity for a moment. So, yes?
Yeah, I got 2 questions. So first of all, how are you actually measuring distance from criticality? I mean, you said it was not necessarily, I would have thought it would have been pure randomness is far away and pure stability would have been the opposite direction. So you're looking at how much the neurons are jumping around relative to the critical point. And the second question is, have you put this 11-year-old subject to a brain scanning yet?
So the first part of this question is
criticality. Did you restate that? I'm a little lost when you
That's
said
kind of what.
Yeah. Okay. So the first question is, what is criticality a little more specifically, and how do you measure it in a brain? And then have I subjected Chase to that? No, but he does build electrodes in my lab, so he is doing work. Right. He doesn't. Yeah. He's not a subject yet. If we think back to that diagram I put up with the blinking blue dots, if you were to, there's 2 ways that we measure criticality, and one of them is a little more intuitive than the other, so I'll start there. If you were to make a plot of probability versus the kind of pattern size. When you have that, remember the initial state that was just damped? It would just kind of blink and die out. Are you ever going to see large patterns of 1,000 blinking dots there? No. So the probability that you're going to see a small pattern is extremely high, and then you'd basically see this. It just the system can never access large patterns. And in a supercritical regime, where you're having a seizure, you would just sort of have an enrichment of patterns over here. And so if you were to observe a system for a while and start to characterize these patterns, you just measure the size of any pattern before it kind of fades and dies out and moves on. At criticality, what you'll see is a power law here. So if this is log and log, this becomes a straight line. And that means that it does not have scale, right? It doesn't have any intrinsic characteristic scale. It becomes scale-free. And so
I guess what confused me is your whole point on it's not really randomness versus pure stability, but it kind of is. I mean, you're looking at random, so it has to do with the scale of the thing too.
It becomes scale-free precisely at the transition point between those two things that are indeed scaled, right? And so when you look at the other way to do this is to effectively ask if, remember when I showed all the little wiggles as you zoom out and zoom out and zoom out? You can fit what's called an autoregressive model to your data, and then you can effectively ask if that autoregressive model that fits your data is close to a subset, a family of the total number of possible models that are themselves scale-free, right? And that basically means does that time signature, that wobble, maintain its same statistics as you zoom out and zoom out and zoom out and zoom out indefinitely?
So the statistics were changing as you went up in time.
Well, no, the point there is that they're not changing. You're right, they don't have a scale, right? Right. Now, in any realistic system, you'll get to a place where it does fall apart. And so it's not about are you at criticality or not, because the point here that my colleague Woody Shu is at Arkansas, and he's wonderful, he's in physics there. The point that we can now really, really exquisitely quantify is that it's not about being at this line, it's that as you move further and further away from this, your computational capacity just closes up, right? Either way, right. So what we're basically measuring is how close is an animal to this distribution, and then we can basically say, well, as this thing starts to fold and move, so waking experience, for example, bends the line this way. Alzheimer's actually splits it both ways. We see it jump between these two regimes that get further and further and further away, et cetera. So there's a question back here and then there.
So for that rat that was taught how to move across the ladder,
Yeah.
Is that because of it keeps on doing it every time, or could you move that ladder, like move how the rungs work, and it still do it perfectly every time?
So the question is, with the mice that were crossing the ladder, what would happen if we rearranged the rungs? So that's a really, really great question, because the animal's very bad at it at first, and then it kind of memorizes the motor pattern the same way you can jog up and down a set of stairs. But if I were to take your stairs at home and eliminate every fourth stair, you'd have to slow down and relearn that. And we see the same thing, that the animal, all right, so let's get into the weeds. It needs to be near criticality to learn how to cross the ladder. But then that solution, right? So finding that set of connections doesn't need to be critical anymore. It could be a very scaled thing. The ladder always takes 1.2 seconds, and it's always the same movements. But for the animal to be able to adapt again and learn a new arrangement of the ladder, it has to go back to criticality. It has to get back to that thing. So think about Caitlin Clark. When she goes up for a jump shot for the 20,000th time, the jump shot is very scaled, right? Criticality is scale-free. The jump shot is not. Right? You'll never see her take 77 seconds for a jump shot. It is always the same thing. But if she starts wearing a new pair of shoes, or if something changes, for her to be able to adapt and readapt that jump shot and learn to bring in those new sources of information, she would have to be able to sort of shift back to that regime. And so that's exactly what we see there. When we muck with the ladder and we change the ordering of the rungs, it's the animal's ability to jump between these regimes that predicts how quickly it will be able to consolidate that new pattern.
So do you have I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Do you have a measure of that ability to jump back and forth between the different regimes? And if your model is predictive, does that mean that value is constant throughout a person's life?
So so the first question is, do we have a measure of the ability to jump between those regimes? And the second is that value constant throughout life? So we can literally measure how close the animal is to critical. And so we can look at an animal's proximity to criticality during the kind of very stereotyped task. So running across the ladder, once the animal has learned it, again, it's very patterned, it's very crystallized, it's like counting to 10, it does not require much integration. So it actually ends up finding a solution. It has to start at criticality, and then it finds a solution that is not critical. In contrast, the prey capture task does require integration across a lot of timescales. That solution is very close to criticality. So, but if we go back to this ladder thing, if we change the ladder, we can see that when the animal goes back on the ladder, basically as it starts to realize, uh-oh, things are different, you can actually watch the brain shift, and you can just measure that kind of that range and that shift. Beyond that, this is kind of cutting edge stuff right now.
Right. Well, I was interested in the predictive value of the Alzheimer's thing, right? So if it's predictive, is it constant, right?
So to that point though, this is my favorite part, and I didn't have time to get into this to talk, but again, I think that the purpose of sleep in any species is to restore this point. And when we augment an animal's sleep, we can actually massively delay or prevent what should be a genetic death sentence. So we can restore cognitive function and delay disease even in the beginning stages of disease in an animal. And so these set points, I mean, maybe there's a range that you're locked in at genetically, but within that range, you have control, and sleep seems to be a major lever by which to manipulate that system.
I understand the underlying principle of these things, but of course there's also the effect of the immune system and the environment that perturbs the system, right? So you want to address the biological part too, I would think, not just sleep. I don't know, just asking.
So I don't understand the question.
Oh no, you're saying that when we talked about amyloid proteins or tau bodies and all that, that's not the reason why you're into this disease state. But
that's not what I said.
Okay, I misheard that.
No, I'm saying that tau and amyloid aren't the disease. They might be. There's a difference between cause and effect, and what we care about is the effect. Because if you have tau in your brain, but you have no cognitive problems, then it's not a big deal, right? So the presence of tau itself isn't an issue.
I understand that, but they're also trying to figure out why those things accumulate. What's the role of that? Maybe.
Well, so let me point out another factor here then, which is that, again, I think we're taking too reductionist of an approach here, that there must be a cause and everything else is a subsequent effect. And I think this is actually more of a dynamical system. And so that obviously these animals have they have a genetic component that predicts this, but then I can have two animals that are effectively clones of one another, and one of them will get the disease much earlier and more aggressively than the other. And so there has to be some role for something in brain activity and environment, even though they're raised in the same lab, that can explain these different endpoints and pathways. And so we've known for a long time that people who do shift work and people with insomnia get worse and more frequent neurodegenerative disease than people who sleep normally. Recently, it's been very clearly demonstrated that is causal, and I think we can actually go the other way as well. So the causal connection that's been established is that if we disrupt sleep, things get worse for your disease. So wouldn't it be an interesting model if the disease is as follows, that you have a predisposition because of a gene, and that starts to break sleep. But by breaking sleep, you actually feed back on the misfolding of that protein, and then the misfolding of that protein further breaks sleep, which further feeds back on this. And so because now we're looking at a dynamical system, like the idea of a separation between those things is silly, you can push on either part of that equation to stall the total outcome of it. That's what I'm arguing. And I'm saying that the thing that we actually care about rescuing ultimately is the dynamics. And we can actually affect the protein misfolding and cell death by taking advantage of sleep, whose endpoint is the restoration of healthy dynamics.
Okay, no, I got that.
Cool, yeah. Happy Saturday.